The very mention of those designated detention facilities conjures certain notorious locales, places synonymous with unimaginable suffering, with the systematic deprivation and dissolution of human life. Names are spoken in hushed tones, etched into the collective consciousness, grim reminders of a dark chapter of history. But overshadowed by these infamous locales, lurking in the shadows of historical record, exists another site of horror, a place whose name is whispered, if it is spoken at all: Ravensbrück. Located a mere expanse from Berlin, it defies easy categorization, not equipped for immediate mass destruction like some facilities, yet it was perhaps even more insidious in its slow, agonizing approach to extermination. It stands as a stark, forgotten monument to human cruelty, a facility dedicated solely to the confinement and calculated destruction of women. Unlike its more widely known counterparts, Ravensbrück lacks the iconic imagery that has seared itself into the world's collective memory. The liberation footage, the piles of emaciated corpses, the faces of shell-shocked survivors. It is a void in the visual narrative of that era, a silence that has allowed its story to remain largely untold. Yet, within its confines, over 100,000 women endured a systematic campaign of dehumanization, brutality, and death. It was a place designed to break the human spirit, to strip its inmates of their dignity, their hope, and ultimately their lives. The genesis of Ravensbrück lies in the twisted ideology of one of history's most ruthless figures. In the early months of 1938, the architect of calculated oppression envisioned a new type of confinement centre, one that departed from the existing model of incarcerating male political adversaries. This proposed facility would be exclusively for women, specifically those deemed undesirable by the prevailing order. This label encompassed a wide array of individuals, those who defied conventional societal norms, members of religious or political organisations deemed subversive, and women of certain ethnicities. In the warped logic of the regime, these individuals represented a threat to the purity and stability of the ideal social structure, and were therefore to be isolated, controlled, and ultimately eliminated. The selection of Ravensbrück as the location for this facility was no accident. Situated amidst the seemingly tranquil landscape of northern Germania, its location offered both seclusion and strategic accessibility. Far removed from major urban centres, it could operate with a degree of relative obscurity, shielded from the prying eyes of the outside world. Yet, its proximity to major transportation arteries ensured the efficient movement of prisoners from all corners of the occupied territories. Furthermore, the area held a certain personal significance for some individuals in power, who were fond of the nearby hunting grounds and viewed the surrounding forests as symbols of national heritage. This perceived purity stood in stark contrast to the perceived impurity of the women who would soon be confined within its walls. The construction of Ravensbrück began in the late months of 1938, carried out by prisoners transferred from nearby facilities. They cleared the land, erected the first crude barracks, and built the imposing watchtowers that would soon dominate the landscape. The perimeter fences strung with barbed wire began to take shape, marking the boundaries of a new realm of suffering. The air was thick with the anticipation of impending doom, a silent harbinger of the horrors to come. By the spring of 1939, just months before the outbreak of global conflict, Ravensbrück was ready to receive its first victims. Hundreds of women, rounded up from various regions, were herded onto trains, their destinations unknown, their futures uncertain. As they stepped onto the grounds of Ravensbrück, they entered a world devoid of hope, a world where their very humanity would be systematically stripped away. The initial cohort of inmates, numbering almost 1,000, were a diverse group drawn from across the country and even from neighbouring lands. Few understood the nature of their destination or the reasons for their confinement. As the trains screeched to a halt, releasing their human cargo, the women were met with a scene of calculated intimidation, armed guards, barking dogs, and a cacophony of shouted commands. This was Ravensbrück's welcome, a brutal introduction to the reality of their captivity. Driven through the imposing iron gates, the women were herded into a central square, surrounded by rows of austere grey barracks. The air was thick with the smells of freshly cut lumber and damp earth, a deceptive contrast to the sense of dread that permeated the atmosphere. Here, amidst the mud and the barbed wire, the process of dehumanization began in earnest. Possessions were confiscated, identities were erased, and names were replaced with numbers. The outbreak of global conflict marked a turning point for Ravensbrück, accelerating its expansion and solidifying its role as a central hub in the system of repression. As the territories under control grew, so too did the influx of prisoners. New barracks were constructed, workshops were established, and the infrastructure of suffering expanded to accommodate the ever-growing population. Over the next years, tens of thousands of women would pass through those gates, their lives irrevocably altered, their fates sealed within the confines of Ravensbrück. Each arrival marked the beginning of a new cycle of torment, a fresh wave of human misery to be absorbed into the camp's insatiable maw. Upon arrival, the new prisoners were subjected to a ritual of degradation designed to break their spirit and assert the dominance of their captors. Exhausted from their journeys, deprived of food and water, they were forced to endure hours of standing at attention, exposed to the elements. Any sign of weakness was met with swift and brutal punishment, a lesson in the consequences of defiance. This initial ordeal was followed by a complete and utter stripping of identity. Every woman, regardless of age or background, was forced to disrobe completely in front of strangers, a violation of their most basic human dignity. Their bodies were searched, their hair was shorn, and their personal belongings were confiscated. They were reduced to a state of utter vulnerability, stripped of everything that made them individuals. Clad in ill-fitting garments and issued a single metal bowl, the women were assigned their new identities, a number, often sewn onto their clothing, that would serve as their only designation within the camp. Names were forbidden, individuality was suppressed, and the women were reduced to mere ciphers in the machinery of oppression. Imagine a child, barely past her infancy, thrust into this nightmare. Her head shaved, her name forgotten, her parents nowhere to be seen. She does not understand the language of her captors, nor the reasons for her suffering. She is alone, lost in a world of unimaginable cruelty. The daily routine at Ravensbrück was a relentless cycle of labour, deprivation, and terror, designed to erode the physical and mental strength of the prisoners. Every day began before dawn with the jarring shriek of a siren that shattered the fragile remnants of sleep. The women were forced to dress in the darkness and assemble in the main yard, where they would stand for hours during roll call. Regardless of the weather, they were forced to stand in formation, subjected to the scrutiny of the guards. Any deviation from the prescribed posture, any accidental eye contact, could result in a beating or worse. The atmosphere was thick with fear, a constant reminder of the ever-present threat of violence. The barracks, each designed to house a fraction of its actual population, were overcrowded, unsanitary, and breeding grounds for disease. The women were crammed into bunks designed for one, with barely enough room to move. Hygiene was non-existent and outbreaks of illness were rampant. Food rations were meagre, barely enough to sustain life. Watery soup and stale bread were the staples of their diet, supplemented occasionally by scraps of other refuse. Malnutrition was rampant, and the women grew weaker and weaker with each passing day. Medical care was virtually non-existent. The sick were ignored, punished, or simply left to die. Children, particularly vulnerable to the harsh conditions, suffered the most. Some were born in the camp, while others arrived with their mothers. Many succumbed to hunger, disease, or cold. Some disappeared, never to be seen again. It became clear that Ravensbrück was not designed for quick extermination. Its true purpose was to break the women slowly, to grind them down through relentless labour, starvation, fear, and exhaustion. It was a war of attrition, waged against the human spirit. Adding to the horror of Ravensbrück was the presence of female guards. These individuals, numbering over hundreds, played a significant role in the camp's reign of terror. Dressed in grey uniforms and armed with whips and clubs, they were often more brutal than their male counterparts. Known as the Crows by the prisoners, they were figures of fear and loathing, symbols of the camp's perverse inversion of humanity. Many of these guards came from ordinary backgrounds. Some were former factory workers, secretaries or housewives, drawn to the job by the promise of better pay, housing and food. But something changed when they donned the uniform. Within weeks, they often transformed into cruel, callous and violent individuals. They came to view the prisoners not as human beings, but as problems to be managed or punished. Some guards gained notoriety for their extreme brutality, inflicting beatings, torture, and even death upon their helpless charges. The question of what drove these women to such cruelty remains a subject of debate. Some suggest it was fear of punishment, while others believe they relished the power they held over their victims. Whatever the reason, their actions left indelible scars on the lives of those they guarded. Within the walls of Ravensbrück, forced labour was a central component of the camp's operation. Many of the prisoners were assigned to work in factories, producing goods for the German war effort. The infamous company was built adjacent to the barracks, a symbol of the camp's integration into the machinery of oppression. The women worked long hours under strict supervision, with little food and no rest. They produced components for weapons, electronics, and even rocket systems, contributing directly to the war effort of their captors. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and often pointless. Accidents were common, and injuries were rarely treated. Yet the women were forced to continue working, driven by fear and the need to survive. Some women were forced to staff brothels in other facilities. These were designed to reward male prisoners who were deemed to be productive workers. In most cases, the women had no choice in the matter. They were forced into sexual slavery, subjected to abuse and exploitation. Many died quickly from disease and violence. But even this was not the worst of the horrors that occurred within the walls of Ravensbrück. A darker chapter of the camp's history was about to begin. In 1942, Ravensbrück became the site of a series of medical experiments that would forever stain the name of the camp. These experiments, conducted by doctors acting under the orders of superiors, were designed to test theories and drugs under controlled conditions. But the conditions were anything but humane. Women were selected as test subjects. Many of them were young political prisoners. They were healthy at first, but their bodies were intentionally broken and destroyed in the name of science. These women were known as the rabbits by their fellow prisoners, a reflection of their status as mere lab animals. The doctors performed surgeries on their legs, cutting through muscles and nerves. In some cases, their bones were deliberately broken. Foreign objects such as glass, wood splinters, and dirt were inserted into their wounds to simulate battlefield infections. Bacteria were injected into the injuries to create life-threatening conditions. Some women had bones or entire muscle sections removed. Many were left permanently disabled, unable to walk, and suffering from chronic pain. The experiments caused swelling, fever, and open sores that refused to heal. No real pain relief was given. Some of the women developed gangrene. Several died. Others were executed after the tests, likely to hide the evidence of what had been done to them. Yet, even in the face of such unspeakable cruelty, acts of courage and resistance emerged from within the camp. Fellow prisoners risked their lives to help the rabbits, hiding them, swapping identification numbers, and moving them secretly from block to block to protect them from further harm. These acts of solidarity were a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a refusal to succumb to the dehumanizing forces of the camp. They demonstrated that even in the darkest of times, compassion and courage could still prevail. Pause for a moment and imagine the pain of being operated on without anesthesia. Imagine someone deliberately inserting glass into your open wound. These women were not criminals or combatants. They were simply deemed undesirable, and their suffering was considered inconsequential. But even this was not the end of the horrors of Ravensbrück. As the camp became increasingly overcrowded, a new tragedy began to unfold. By the late months of 1944, Ravensbrück was bursting at the seams. Thousands of women had been deported there from across Europe, and many of them arrived pregnant. Initially, the camp authorities had sought to prevent births. Pregnant women were often forced to undergo abortions or were selected for extermination. However, as the camp population exploded and conditions worsened, they changed. They began allowing babies to be born but not to survive. The result was a place known as the children's room. It sounded harmless, even gentle, but in reality, it was one of the most horrifying places in the camp. The children's room was a bare, cold room with metal beds and no medical care. Dozens of babies were left there with almost no food, no blankets, and no attention. Most of them died within days or weeks. The mothers, already weakened by forced labour and starvation, had no strength left to care for their children. They were not allowed extra food, clean water, or rest. Some women tried desperately to keep their babies alive. They shared their meagre rations, offered comfort, and sang lullabies in hushed voices, but it was rarely enough. The babies grew thinner by the day, their cries becoming weaker and weaker. Some looked like tiny old men, with sunken cheeks and hollow eyes. The guards ignored the dying children, leaving them to perish in silence. The mothers would leave for work in the factory each morning, not knowing whether their child would still be alive when they returned. Often they were not. Bodies were removed without ceremony, tossed into mass graves or burned in the crematorium. Among the many horrors of Ravensbrück, survivors often cited the children's room as the worst. It was a place where innocence was systematically destroyed, where the most vulnerable members of society were left to die. What kind of ideology allows babies to die by design? What does it say about a regime when even the smallest and most innocent are seen as enemies? In the final months of the conflict, as the regime began to collapse, the violence at Ravensbrück reached new levels. Until that point, most of the deaths in the camp had resulted from starvation, disease, forced labour, or execution by shooting or injection. But in early 1945, a decision was made to increase the rate of extermination. A gas chamber was constructed. Unlike the large killing facilities at other camps, the gas chamber at Ravensbrück was small and disguised. It looked like a simple hut located near the crematorium. There were no warning signs. It was built quickly and quietly, with the help of prisoners who had been brought in for the task. But even though it was small, it was deadly. In just 3 months, more than 6,000 people were murdered there. Most were women and children who were sick, elderly, or too weak to work. The killings were carried out hastily and without regard for human life. The gas was most likely the same chemical used in other camps. Women were herded into the hut in groups. They were told they were going to take a shower, but once the doors closed, they were sealed in and the gas was released. Within minutes, the victims were dead. Their bodies were then removed and burned in the crematorium. Why did the regime implement this policy so late in the conflict? Because the opposing armies were closing in. They wanted to eliminate as many prisoners as possible before the camp could be liberated. They wanted no witnesses, no survivors to tell the truth about what had happened there. The gas chamber was small, but its purpose was the same as every other aspect of the camp: to destroy human life quietly, efficiently, and without mercy. Even within the walls of Ravensbrück, surrounded by death, sickness, and fear, many women chose to resist in whatever ways they could. Some organized secret education programs, teaching lessons in hushed voices. Others forged documents, swapped identities, or sabotaged the tools they were forced to make for the industry. Inmates in workshops would damage wiring or misplace parts, knowing that even a small act of resistance was a form of Survival. One of the most remarkable acts of defiance came in the form of letters. Women wrote messages using invisible ink made from their own urine and smuggled them out, hidden between the lines of ordinary correspondence. These notes reached various entities. In them they exposed the truth of the medical experiments and warned of mass killings. They knew what they were risking, but they wrote anyway. Others turned to something even more basic: memory and creativity. Despite the rules, prisoners created dolls, bracelets, and keepsakes out of scraps of fabric and thread. These small handmade objects were their way of affirming their humanity. They slept with them hidden in their clothes, knowing they could be beaten or killed if caught, but it gave them strength. In the spring of 1945, the opposing forces finally reached Ravensbrück. They found a small number of women still alive. These women had survived what seemed impossible. Others had not been so lucky. In the days before liberation, the authorities forced thousands of prisoners on death marches, walking them into the forest to die or be killed. There were no film crews recorded the liberation. There were no photos, no dramatic footage like at other camps. The world barely noticed. And for many of the women who were freed, the nightmare did not end. Some were assaulted. There are no statistics, but testimony suggests that abuse was widespread and the survivors had no protection. When they returned home, they were often met with silence. People did not want to talk about what had happened to them. Some were ashamed. Others were simply ignored. A few gave testimony at trials and tried to explain what had happened, but for many, justice never came. That might be the most painful truth. To survive something so cruel, and then to be forgotten. To be treated as invisible again. When Ravensbrück was liberated, a note was found on the body of a young girl. It read, "Oh, remember those of ill will, but do not remember all the suffering they have inflicted on us. Remember the fruits we have borne thanks to this suffering, our courage, our generosity, the greatness of heart which has grown out of all of this. And when they come to judgment, let all the fruits we have borne be their forgiveness." That heartbreaking message is a reminder that those who went through Ravensbrück did not just suffer. They resisted, endured, and left behind a truth the world should never forget. So why has this place been overlooked? Why is it known so little compared to other sites? It did not leave behind iconic images. There were no film crews on the day it was liberated, no dramatic footage of survivors. The world moved on. The camp was liberated, and for decades, much of its story remained buried. Survivors who tried to speak were often ignored. Another reason it faded into silence is because it did not fit the dominant narrative. While individuals of certain ethnicities were among the victims, the majority of prisoners there were not of that background. Over a large percentage were political prisoners, women arrested for resistance, or simply for defying the regime. There were also those who defied norms and even members of religious orders. This diversity made the camp harder to classify within the simplified narratives. The facility was also not designed for fast destruction. It was not like other facilities with a purpose-built killing system from day one. Its method of destruction was slower. Forced labour, starvation, disease, experiments, and terror. That kind of suffering was harder to portray in a simple way. It did not offer the same efficiency that some historians and filmmakers focus on when telling the story. Finally, the very fact that it was a place for women made it easier to overlook. In the years after the conflict, many did not see the place as a priority. Male experience was prioritized, and often the only perspective sought. But the suffering was just as real, just as brutal, just as important to remember. Why do stories like this disappear from the records? Was the silence after the conflict accidental or intentional? The story of Ravensbrück is a story of unspeakable cruelty, but it is also a story of courage, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The women who endured those horrors refused to be broken. They resisted in whatever ways they could, supporting each other and clinging to their humanity in the face of unimaginable adversity. Their story is a reminder of the importance of remembering the past, of confronting the darkest chapters of human history, and of learning from the mistakes of previous generations. It is a reminder that we must never forget the victims of oppression, and that we must always stand up against injustice, wherever it may occur. The echoes of Ravensbrück still resonate today, a testament to the enduring legacy of suffering and the importance of remembering the forgotten. It is a story that demands to be told, a story that must never be forgotten.